Some stories leave marks on the soul, wounds that never fully heal. Henry Dawson has lived for over 30 years with the unbearable weight of loss, the ghost of a past he could never reclaim. One stormy night, his wife and daughter disappeared without a trace, swallowed by the unknown, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions. He gave up everything: his home, his name, his life, becoming nothing more than a shadow wandering the streets. But what if the past wasn't truly lost? What if the truth had been buried all this time, waiting for the right moment to resurface? A message hidden in the most unexpected place will force Henry to question everything he thought he knew. Who is watching him? Why now? And above all, is his daughter still alive? Stay until the end, because nothing is as it seems. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know who is ready to uncover the truth with me. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and made the body ache. The streets were nearly empty, the city lights casting a dim, melancholic glow on the wet pavement. Henry Dawson sat on the same bench he had called home for years, his tattered coat pulled tight around his body, his fingers numb from the wind. He had stopped counting how many winters he had endured like this. Time had lost its meaning long ago. The only thing that remained was the echo of a past he had tried and failed to forget. His days blurred together, waking up to the sound of passing cars, scouring trash bins for anything edible, avoiding the judging stares of those who hurried past him, as if looking at him for too long would make them catch his misfortune. But tonight felt different. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the way the streetlights flickered, or the way the wind carried whispers he couldn't understand. Or maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, like it often did when exhaustion took over. Then it happened. A man, tall, wearing a long dark coat, appeared from the shadows. He walked slowly, deliberately, stopping right in front of Henry. He said nothing, only reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. Without a word, he placed it on the bench beside Henry and walked away, disappearing into the night. Henry stared at the envelope, his heartbeat suddenly louder than the noise of the city. He hesitated before picking it up, his fingers trembling slightly. There was no name, no address, just a small, folded piece of paper inside. His breath hitched as he read the words written in shaky handwriting. "She is alive." His mind went blank. His hands clenched around the paper, his chest tightening. No, it wasn't possible. It had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. He read the words again as if hoping they would change, but they didn't. She is alive. His pulse pounded in his ears, memories flooding his mind all at once. The storm, the screams, the desperate search for them in the wreckage, the years of hopelessness that followed. He had convinced himself that they were gone, that they had to be gone, because the alternative, the thought that they were out there somewhere waiting for him, was too much to bear. A sudden gust of wind made the paper slip from his fingers. He lunged for it, his movements clumsy, but he managed to grab it before it was lost. His breath came in short, uneven gasps. Who had sent this? Why now? And most importantly, was it true? He barely noticed the presence of someone else nearby until a soft voice cut through the night. "Are you okay, sir?" Henry turned sharply. A young woman stood a few feet away, her eyes filled with concern. She was holding a tray, probably from the diner behind her, her uniform slightly oversized, as if it had been given to her at the last minute. "Do you need something warm to eat?" she asked gently. Henry's throat was dry. He hadn't spoken to anyone in more than a day. He wanted to tell her to go away, that he didn't need her pity. But then he saw her face. Something about her felt familiar. His chest tightened again. It wasn't possible. His mind was playing tricks on him. She waited, shifting awkwardly, then set the tray down beside him. "Here, you don't have to talk. Just eat something, okay?" And with that, she turned and walked back inside. Henry didn't move for a long time. The city around him felt distant, blurred. Finally, he looked down at the tray. A burger, fries, a small cup of steaming coffee. His stomach ached at the sight of real food, but his hands refused to move. Then, as he reached for the burger, something slipped out from between the bun. A small, crumpled note. His fingers shook as he unfolded it. His breath caught in his throat. "Emma is alive." The world tilted. His vision blurred. His mind screamed at him that this was impossible. And yet, there it was, written in the same shaky handwriting. Henry's chest rose and fell in uneven gasps. His fingers gripped the note so tightly it nearly tore. His mind was spinning, his heart pounding against his ribs. Was it real? Was it possible? And if it was, who was the girl who had just handed it to him? Henry's fingers clenched around the small note, his heartbeat erratic, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The words on the paper burned into his mind like fire, sending him spiraling into a past he had long tried to bury. Emma is alive. It didn't make sense. Couldn't be true. But there it was, written in black ink, taunting him, daring him to believe in something he had given up on decades ago. His gaze flickered back to the diner's window, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the young waitress moving between tables, balancing trays with practiced ease. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way, but something deep inside him told him that she knew exactly what she had done. Who was she? His stomach churned with a mixture of hope and dread. He wanted to get up, to go inside and demand answers, but his legs refused to move. He had spent so many years accepting his fate, convincing himself that the past was gone forever, that there was no point in looking back. And now, in the span of a single night, everything had changed. His mind raced through possibilities. Was this a mistake? A cruel joke? Or worse, was it a lie? Henry's grip on the note tightened as memories flooded back. Memories he had locked away for his own survival. The storm, the rain beating down so hard he could barely see. The frantic search for Margaret and Emma. The way his voice had cracked as he screamed their names into the roaring wind. And then darkness. Cold, endless darkness. He had woken up in a hospital days later, with nothing but a deep, soul-crushing emptiness inside him. They were gone. They had to be gone. Because if they weren't, it meant he had given up on them. And that was a truth he couldn't bear. But now someone was telling him he had been wrong. Henry forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to steady his shaking hands. He needed to think. He needed to understand what was happening before he let himself hope. He glanced at the tray of food beside him, untouched. His stomach ached with hunger, but the weight of the note in his hand was heavier than any physical need. He looked at the diner again. The girl, Lily, according to her name tag, was refilling a man's coffee, smiling politely, completely unaware that she had just shattered his world. Or was she? The door swung open, and an older man stepped out, buttoning his coat against the cold. Henry recognized him, a regular at the shelter, a man who always kept to himself. The man hesitated before looking at him, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he walked away. Something about the moment unsettled Henry. There was an unease in the air, a sense that he was being watched, that there were eyes on him that he couldn't see. He turned his gaze back to Lily. She was laughing at something a coworker had said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. And for a brief moment, something inside him cracked. That small gesture, so familiar, so heartbreakingly familiar, sent a shock through his system. Margaret used to do that. Henry's breath caught in his throat. No, it was just a coincidence. It had to be. He ran a hand over his face, trying to clear his thoughts, but the feeling wouldn't leave him. His mind was screaming at him to move, to do something. But what? He had nothing. No answers. No proof. Just a single piece of paper and a waitress who had become an enigma in the span of a few minutes. He needed help. The thought made his stomach turn. He had spent so long avoiding people, keeping his head down, staying invisible. He didn't trust easily, not anymore. But there was one person who might be able to help him make sense of this. Ethan Carter. Henry hadn't seen him in years, but if there was one person who could find answers, it was Ethan. A journalist who had made a name for himself exposing secrets people wanted buried. The only problem? Ethan had no reason to help him. The last time they had spoken, Henry had been a different man, bitter and angry at the world. He had pushed Ethan away, just like he had pushed everyone away. Would he even listen now? Henry didn't have a choice. He needed to know if this was real. If there was even the slightest chance that Emma was alive, he had to find out. Determined, he pushed himself up from the bench, his body protesting the sudden movement. He shoved the note deep into his pocket and started walking. The diner faded into the background as he moved through the streets, each step feeling heavier than the last. He knew where to find Ethan. The man practically lived in his office, drowning himself in unfinished stories and half-empty coffee cups. It took nearly an hour to reach the building. The office was small, wedged between a laundromat and a pawn shop, its flickering sign barely holding on. Henry hesitated at the door, an old habit of second-guessing himself creeping in. But he couldn't walk away now. He knocked twice. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and there he was. Ethan looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then finally he sighed. "You look like hell." Henry let out a dry chuckle. "Nice to see you too." Ethan studied him, then stepped aside. "Come in. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't important." Henry stepped inside, the warmth of the office a stark contrast to the cold outside. Papers were scattered everywhere, notes pinned to the walls, the smell of coffee and ink thick in the air. Ethan crossed his arms. "All right, what's going on?" Henry reached into his pocket and pulled out the note. He handed it to Ethan, watching as the journalist's face shifted from confusion to something else, something serious. Ethan read the words, his eyes narrowing. Then he looked up. "Where did you get this?" Henry swallowed hard. "Someone left it for me tonight." Ethan's expression darkened. "Who?" Henry hesitated. "A waitress, at a diner downtown." Ethan's jaw tightened. "What's her name?" "Lily." Ethan's reaction was immediate. His face went pale, his eyes sharp with something Henry couldn't quite place. Henry frowned. "You know her?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he set the note down carefully, his fingers tapping against the desk in thought. Then, after a long silence, he said something that made Henry's blood run cold. "Lily Harper doesn't exist." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Henry's voice was barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I've been looking into something for a while now. A woman who's been showing up under different names, different places, but always around people like you. People with a past they can't let go of." Henry's stomach twisted. "Are you saying?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I don't know who she really is, but if she gave you that note, then she's not just some waitress." The room fell into silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. If Lily wasn't who she said she was, then who was she? And more importantly, what did she want from him? The words hung heavy in the air, sinking deep into Henry's chest like lead. Lily Harper doesn't exist. It didn't make sense. He had seen her, spoken to her, watched her move through that diner like she belonged there. She was real. She had to be real. But if Ethan was right, if she wasn't who she claimed to be, then what was she doing? And more importantly, why had she given him that note? Ethan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the cluttered desk, his sharp eyes never leaving Henry's face. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Henry exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. His thoughts were still a tangled mess, but he knew he didn't have the luxury of time to process things at his own pace. He had come here for answers, and the only way to get them was to lay everything out in the open. "I was sitting in my usual spot, outside the diner. It was late, and this man, he just walked up to me and handed me an envelope. He didn't say a word, just left it there and disappeared." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the first note, placing it on the desk between them. Ethan studied it carefully, his fingers brushing over the edges of the paper, as if he could extract hidden secrets from it. "And then," Ethan prompted. Henry hesitated. This next part felt even more surreal, like something out of a dream he wasn't sure he had actually lived through. "Lily came outside. She brought me food like she does sometimes, but there was another note inside the burger. The second one. He placed it next to the first. The words stared back at him, taunting him. Emma is alive. Ethan's jaw tightened. So she didn't say anything directly? Just left the note and walked away. Henry nodded. She didn't even look at me, like she knew what she had done but didn't want me to know she knew. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the desk. This doesn't add up, he muttered. Someone went through a lot of trouble to get these messages to you, but why in such a cryptic way? If Emma really is alive, why not just come forward? Why the secrecy? Henry swallowed hard, the familiar ache of doubt creeping in. Maybe because it's not true, he admitted, his voice raw. Maybe it's just some sick game someone's playing. A way to mess with me. Ethan shook his head. No, this is too calculated to be a prank. Someone wants you to find her, but they're being careful about it. Which means there's something or someone they're afraid of. He looked up, his expression unreadable. And that means you should be afraid too. A shiver ran down Henry's spine. He had spent years surviving on the streets, learning how to read people, how to sense when danger was close. And right now, every instinct in him was screaming that Ethan was right. Then what do we do? Henry asked, his voice quiet. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, walked over to a filing cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a thick folder. He tossed it onto the desk, flipping it open to reveal pages of articles, reports, and photographs. Henry frowned as he scanned the documents, his pulse quickening when he recognized some of the faces. This is what I've been working on, Ethan said. Over the past few years, I've come across stories like yours. People who lost someone, people who thought they would never see them again. And then, out of nowhere, they get a message, a hint, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the person they lost isn't lost at all. Henry's throat tightened. And? What happened to them? Ethan hesitated. Some found the truth. Others disappeared before they could. The words sent a chill through Henry's entire body. Disappeared. Ethan met his gaze. Vanished. No trace. Like they never existed. The weight of it pressed down on Henry like an iron fist. He wanted to believe that this was different, that his situation wasn't like the others. But deep down, he knew that was just wishful thinking. Then we have to move fast, Henry said, forcing down the fear that threatened to choke him. If someone's trying to lead me to Emma, I need to find her before it's too late. Ethan nodded. Agreed. And the first step is figuring out who Lily really is. Henry's hands clenched into fists. And what if she's Emma? The words came out before he could stop them. The possibility hanging between them like an unspoken truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. Ethan was silent for a long moment. Then he sighed. If she is, then she's been hiding for a reason. And if she's been hiding, that means there's something bigger at play here. Henry exhaled shakily. Then let's find out what it is. The next morning, Henry stood outside the diner, his breath fogging in the crisp morning air. The sun was barely rising, casting long shadows across the empty streets. He hadn't slept. His mind had been too full of questions, of possibilities, of fears. He had to talk to her. He had to know. The diner's doors finally unlocked, and a few employees trickled in for the morning shift. Henry waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, until he saw her. Lily. She walked toward the entrance, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, a tired look in her eyes. For a brief moment, Henry hesitated. But then he reminded himself he couldn't afford to be afraid. Not now. Lily, he called out. She froze. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something guarded. Hey, Henry, she said softly. You're here early. Henry took a step closer. We need to talk. She hesitated, glancing around as if making sure no one was watching. Then she nodded. Not here. Meet me behind the diner in 10 minutes. And just like that, she disappeared inside. Henry let out a shaky breath. This was it. The moment that could change everything. 10 minutes later, he stood in the alley behind the diner, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to keep them from shaking. The air was thick with the smell of old grease and damp concrete. Footsteps echoed, and then she was there. Lily crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "What do you want to ask me, Henry?" His throat felt dry. He swallowed hard. "Are you Emma?" She didn't flinch, didn't react. She just held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment before finally answering. "I don't know," she whispered. Henry's stomach dropped. "What do you mean you don't know?" Lily exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "I don't remember my past. I don't remember anything before I was 8 years old." Henry's breath hitched. 8. Lily's eyes searched his face. "I know you think I look like someone you lost. I can see it in the way you look at me, and I don't know if I'm her. But I do know one thing." Henry barely found the strength to ask. "What?" Lily took a step closer. "Someone doesn't want me to remember who I am." The words sent a cold shiver down Henry's spine, and for the first time he realized he wasn't just searching for Emma. He was unraveling something much bigger than he had ever imagined. Henry felt his breath leave him in a slow, ragged exhale. "Someone doesn't want me to remember who I am." The words echoed in his head, thick with implications, heavy with unspoken truths. He had come here looking for answers, searching for proof that Emma was alive. But now the mystery had grown into something far larger, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Lily's face was calm, but her eyes held something else, something raw and uncertain. She had dropped this revelation into the air between them like a weight neither of them could carry alone. Henry swallowed hard. "What do you mean you don't remember?" His voice was barely above a whisper, his hands tightening into fists at his sides as he fought the urge to reach out, to shake the truth out of her. Lily looked away, biting her lip as if trying to choose her words carefully. "My earliest memory is waking up in a small house with a woman I didn't know. She told me she was my aunt, that my parents had died in an accident. I believed her. I had no reason not to, but things never felt right. She was kind, but distant, and she never spoke about my past. Every time I asked questions, she would shut down. And after a while, I stopped asking." Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. "What was her name?" Lily hesitated. "Eleanor Hayes." The name meant nothing to him, but a sinking feeling twisted his stomach. "And she never gave you any details? No pictures, no family history?" Lily shook her head. "Nothing. Just that I was lucky to be alive and that I should stop looking for things that didn't need to be found." She let out a dry laugh, the sound bitter and empty. "I used to think maybe she was trying to protect me, but now, I don't know. Maybe she was hiding something." Henry took a step back, running a hand over his face. The more he listened, the worse the feeling in his gut became. "And when did you leave her?" Lily sighed, shifting her weight. "When I turned 18, she sat me down and told me it was time to move on, that I needed to make my own life. She gave me a small amount of money, wished me well, and that was it. I never saw her again." Henry studied her carefully. There was no hesitation in her voice, no signs that she was lying. She truly believed she didn't know who she was. And if she was Emma, if she was his daughter, then someone had gone to great lengths to erase her past. His chest tightened. "Lily, why did you give me that note?" Lily's gaze met his, and for the first time, he saw real fear in her eyes. "Because someone left it for me first." A chill ran down Henry's spine. "What?" Lily nodded slowly, carefully pulling something out of her pocket. It was another small, crumpled piece of paper. She hesitated for only a second before handing it to him. Henry's hands shook as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "Give this to him. He deserves to know the truth." No name, no signature, just the same ink, the same style as the first 2 notes. Henry's mouth was dry. "Who gave this to you?" Lily shook her head. "I don't know. I found it inside my locker 2 days ago. At first, I didn't understand what it meant. But then, when I saw you sitting there, something told me to listen. And when I looked at you, Henry," she swallowed hard, I felt something. Like I knew you. His breath hitched. You don't remember me? Lily's face twisted with something unreadable. No, but I don't know if that's the truth. Maybe I did once. Maybe I just forgot. Henry's chest tightened painfully. He didn't know what was worse, the possibility that she wasn't Emma, or the possibility that she was and had been forced to forget everything. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Lily, I need you to come with me. There's someone who can help us find out the truth. Lily hesitated, glancing back toward the diner. You mean Ethan, don't you? Henry frowned. How do you know about Ethan? Lily's lips pressed into a thin line. Because someone else has been watching you, Henry. And I think they wanted me to know that you weren't alone. A shiver ran through Henry's entire body. Someone had been watching him. Someone had been watching her. The realization made his stomach turn. He had spent years in the shadows, believing he was invisible, unimportant. But now it was clear he wasn't just being pulled into a mystery. He had been part of it all along. Lily, he said slowly, I don't know who's behind this, but I promise you, I'm not going to stop until we get to the truth. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then let's go. The drive to Ethan's office was silent, tension hanging heavy between them. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her fingers gripping the edge of her sweater, her gaze fixed on the passing city lights. Henry stole glances at her, searching for something, anything, that would confirm what his heart already believed. When they finally arrived, Ethan was waiting. He barely acknowledged Henry before his sharp gaze landed on Lily. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ethan exhaled sharply. Well, this just got a lot more interesting. Lily stiffened. You know something, don't you? Ethan motioned for them to sit. I know a lot of things, but I also know when I'm in over my head. He turned to Henry. I ran a background check on Eleanor Hayes. Henry's stomach twisted. And Ethan's lips pressed together. She doesn't exist. At least not officially. No birth records, no employment history. Nothing. Like she was never real. Lily's breath caught. That's not possible. I lived with her for years. Ethan met her gaze. I don't doubt that. But whoever she was, she didn't want anyone finding her. Or you. The room fell into a heavy silence. Henry felt like the floor had been ripped out from under him. Someone had erased Lily's past. Someone had made sure that she never knew where she came from. And now, after all these years, they were being led straight into the truth. Henry clenched his fists. We need to find her. The real Eleanor. If she's still alive, she might have the answers we're looking for. Ethan nodded. Agreed. I'll start digging. But Henry, he hesitated. We have to be careful. Whoever is behind this, they've kept it hidden for a long time. They won't let us expose it easily. Henry swallowed hard. I don't care. I lost everything once. I'm not going to lose her again. Lily's eyes met his, something uncertain flickering behind them. And in that moment, Henry knew, whether or not she remembered him, whether or not she truly was Emma, he was going to fight for her. Because something inside him told him she was worth it. And this time, he wasn't going to fail. The weight of everything pressed down on Henry as he sat in Ethan's office. The dim light casting long shadows across the walls cluttered with documents, photographs, and strings of connection that made no sense to him yet. Lily sat beside him, her body tense, fingers gripping the hem of her sweater as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. She hadn't spoken much since Ethan had revealed the truth about Eleanor Hayes, that she didn't exist, at least not in any official record. But Henry knew that didn't mean she wasn't real. Someone had raised Lily. Someone had told her the story of her past. And that same someone had worked very hard to ensure she never looked any deeper. Ethan exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face before focusing back on the papers in front of him. All right, if we're going to figure this out, we need to go back to the beginning. Lily, do you remember anything at all, about where you lived before Eleanor took you in? Even the smallest detail could help. Lily hesitated, her brows furrowing as she stared at her lap. It's all so blurry, she admitted. I remember the house. It was small, a little outside the city. There was a garden, but it was overgrown, like no one had taken care of it in years. And I remember the smell of something burning. Not fire, but something else. I don't know how to explain it. Ethan scribbled something down in his notes. Anything else? Did you ever have visitors? Did Eleanor ever talk about anyone from her past? Lily bit her lip, shaking her head. No visitors. She didn't even have a phone, at least not one I ever saw. She kept everything locked away, and she never talked about herself. It was like she had no past before I showed up. Henry's jaw tightened. Because maybe she didn't. Lily looked up at him, confusion flickering across her face. What do you mean? Henry met her gaze, his voice quiet but firm. Maybe she was just another piece of the puzzle. Maybe she wasn't supposed to exist either. The room fell into silence. Ethan tapped his pen against the desk, deep in thought. If that's true, then we're dealing with something bigger than just a missing child case. Someone went to extreme lengths to erase her, just like they did with you, Lily. The question is, why? Henry leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. I don't care what it takes. We need to find her. Eleanor might be the only one who knows what really happened. Ethan nodded, already typing something into his computer. I'll see what I can dig up. In the meantime, you two need to be careful. If someone's been watching you, they're not going to like that you're asking questions. Lily shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. I don't even know what I'm looking for. I don't know who I am. Henry's heart ached at the raw emotion in her voice. He reached out instinctively, placing a hand over hers. Then we'll find out together. That night, Henry couldn't sleep. He sat in the small apartment Ethan had set up for them, staring out the window at the city below. The streetlights cast an eerie glow over the empty roads, the occasional car passing by breaking the stillness. Lily was asleep in the next room, but he knew it wasn't peaceful. He had heard her tossing and turning, muttering in her sleep, her dreams plagued by fragments of a past she couldn't quite grasp. Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. His mind was a mess of memories and fears, of what-ifs and maybes. Could it really be her? Could Lily truly be Emma? And if she was, what had happened to her all those years ago? His thoughts were interrupted by a noise outside, a sharp rustling, like footsteps on gravel. Henry's entire body went rigid. He stood slowly, moving toward the window without making a sound. His pulse pounded in his ears as he carefully pulled the curtain aside, peering into the darkness below. A figure, dressed in dark clothing, standing just outside the building. Watching. Henry's breath caught in his throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there silent and still. And then, as if sensing that they had been seen, they turned and disappeared into the night. Henry didn't waste a second. He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, his heart hammering as he took the stairs 2 at a time. He burst out into the street, eyes scanning the darkness, searching. Nothing. The figure was gone. He cursed under his breath, his fists clenching. Someone was following them. Someone knew they were getting too close, and that meant they were on the right track. The next morning, Henry told Ethan everything. Ethan's face darkened as he listened. This isn't good. If they know we're looking, they might try to shut us down before we get anywhere. Henry's grip tightened around his coffee mug. Then we need to move fast. Ethan nodded. I found something last night. A name. It's not much, but it might be a lead. Henry and Lily both leaned in. Who? Ethan turned the screen toward them. A scanned document, old and faded, filled with information that meant little to Henry until he saw the name at the bottom. Eleanor Hayes, birth name, Margaret Dawson. The room went deathly silent. Henry's breath left him in a rush, his hands shaking. No, that's not possible. Ethan looked at him carefully. She's not just a random woman, Henry. She's your wife. Lily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. No, that can't be right. That can't be. Henry felt the air leave his lungs. His vision blurred, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him like an avalanche. Margaret, the woman he had searched for, grieved for, the woman he had believed was lost forever. She had been alive. She had taken in Lily. She had erased herself from existence. And now she was the only one who could tell them why. Henry's hands clenched into fists. Where is she? Ethan hesitated. I don't know yet, but now that I have a real name, I can find her. Just give me time. Time. Henry didn't have time. He had spent over 30 years drowning in loss, believing that his family was gone. And now he knew the truth. Margaret had survived. She had raised Lily, and she had hidden from him. Henry's chest tightened, anger and confusion twisting together in a suffocating grip. Why? Why had she let him believe she was gone? Why had she taken Emma and disappeared? He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Ethan looked up. Henry, I need air. He left before anyone could stop him, stepping out into the crisp morning air. His mind was a storm, memories flashing through his head so fast he could barely breathe. Margaret, alive. Emma, no, Lily, raised by her. And now he had to find her and demand the truth. The cold air bit at Henry's skin as he stood outside the office, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. His mind was a hurricane, thoughts crashing against each other in a chaotic storm. Margaret, alive. The woman he had mourned, the woman he had lost. She had been out there all this time, hidden beneath a different name, raising a child who might be their daughter. The weight of it threatened to crush him. Decades of grief, of searching, of believing that his family had been torn from him in the storm, only to find out that the truth had been just out of reach all along. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself, but nothing about this moment felt real. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Lily stepped out cautiously. She looked hesitant, uncertain, as if she was afraid to approach him. Henry, her voice was soft, unsure. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. There was a storm behind them, an emotion so raw it made his chest tighten. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words felt too heavy, too impossible to form. Lily swallowed, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to hold herself together. I don't know what to say, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to think. Henry let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. Neither do I. A beat of silence passed between them. Then, Lily took a tentative step forward. She raised me, Henry. I don't remember her face well, but I remember the way she spoke, the way she moved. I remember how she never wanted me to ask questions, how she always looked afraid. Her gaze dropped to the ground, as if the weight of the memories was too much. I used to think it was because she didn't want to talk about losing her family, but now, she exhaled shakily. Now I don't know what to believe. Henry's jaw tightened. She let me think she was dead. His voice was low, laced with something dark, something broken. She let me believe that I lost both of you. Lily looked up, and there was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite decipher. Maybe she thought she had to. The words cut through him, sharp and unforgiving. Henry wanted to argue, to tell her that there was no justification for what Margaret had done. But deep down, the question burned inside him. What if she hadn't had a choice? What if there was more to the story than he could see? He turned back to the street, staring out at the passing cars, the people moving about their lives as if the world hadn't just turned upside down. I need to find her. Lily nodded, her voice quiet but steady. Then let's do it. Henry looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time he realized how much strength she carried despite the uncertainty in her past. Whether she was Emma or not, whether she remembered him or not, she was here standing beside him. And that had to mean something. Back inside, Ethan was already buried in his research, fingers flying over the keyboard as he scanned through endless records. I ran a search under the name Eleanor Hayes, he said without looking up. And you were right, it doesn't exist. But the name Margaret Dawson, that's a different story. He clicked on something, then turned the screen toward them. She changed her name legally 29 years ago. No criminal record, no suspicious activity. Just a complete disappearance after that. Henry leaned in, his stomach twisting as he scanned the document. Where was she last seen? Ethan clicked again. According to these records, a small town about 2 hours from here. Quiet, isolated. She hasn't updated any records since then, which means either she left or she never wanted to be found. Henry's hands curled into fists. Then that's where we're going. Ethan hesitated. Henry, are you sure about this? You don't know what you're going to find. Henry met his gaze, determination burning behind his tired eyes. I don't care. I need answers. Ethan sighed but nodded. Then you need to be careful. If she's been hiding, there's a reason for it. And if someone erased Lily's past, there's a reason for that too. Henry exhaled slowly, then turned to Lily. Are you ready for this? She looked uncertain, but then she squared her shoulders, a quiet strength settling in her expression. I have to be. The drive was silent. Henry kept his hands tight on the wheel, his mind spinning with possibilities. What would he say to her? What could he possibly say to a woman who had spent 3 decades avoiding him? Would she even recognize him? Would she tell him the truth? Or would she push him away, just like she had all those years ago? Lily sat beside him, staring out the window, lost in her own thoughts. She had barely spoken since they left, but Henry could feel the tension radiating off of her. You don't have to do this, he said finally, breaking the silence. Lily turned to him, her expression unreadable. Yes, I do. Henry nodded, gripping the wheel a little tighter. Then we'll do it together. The town was smaller than Henry had expected. Barely a handful of stores, a gas station, and a few houses scattered along the main road. It was the kind of place people came to disappear. The kind of place where no one asked questions. Ethan had given them an address. An old house on the outskirts of town, tucked away behind a line of trees. Henry's stomach twisted as he pulled up in front of it. The house was worn, the paint peeling, the windows dark. But it was still standing. And that was enough. He killed the engine, his fingers tightening on the keys. This is it. Lily swallowed, nodding slowly. Okay. Henry stepped out first, his legs stiff from the long drive. The gravel crunched beneath his boots as he made his way toward the front door. Lily followed close behind, her breath coming fast and shallow. He raised his hand to knock, and the door creaked open before he could. A woman stood in the doorway, older than he remembered, but still her. Still Margaret. Henry's breath left him in a rush. She stared at him, her eyes widening, her hand tightening on the edge of the doorframe. And then, Henry. The sound of his name on her lips nearly broke him. He swallowed hard, his voice rough. Margaret. Silence stretched between them, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. Then her gaze flickered to Lily, and something inside her shattered. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. Oh my God! Her voice broke. Emma? Lily froze. Henry felt the world tilt. And just like that, everything changed. The world stood still. Henry felt the weight of Margaret's words crash over him like a tidal wave, swallowing him whole. Emma. She had called Lily Emma. His breath hitched, his chest tightening as he looked from Margaret to Lily, searching for something. Some confirmation, some sign that this was real, that this was the moment he had spent 3 decades waiting for. Lily stood frozen in place, her hands trembling at her sides. Her face was pale, her lips parted slightly as if she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. She blinked rapidly, her gaze locked onto Margaret as if she was staring at a ghost. Margaret took a hesitant step forward, her eyes wide with disbelief, her voice shaking. Is it really you? Lily inhaled sharply, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. The words shattered something in Henry. He wanted to step in, to fix this, to pull them both into his arms and tell them everything was going to be okay. But nothing about this was okay. This wasn't how reunions were supposed to happen. This wasn't how families were supposed to come back together. Margaret's eyes flickered to Henry, and suddenly, the disbelief in her expression was replaced by something else. Guilt, fear, regret. Henry clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You knew, he said, his voice low, barely controlled. You knew she was alive. Margaret flinched as if he had struck her. "Henry, you let me believe you were both dead." His voice cracked, years of grief and anger rising to the surface all at once. "You let me suffer. Let me think I lost everything. Why would you do that to me?" Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but she didn't look away. She took a shaky breath, pressing a hand against the doorframe as if she needed something to hold her up. "I had no choice." Henry let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "No choice? You had every choice, Margaret. You could have come back. You could have told me the truth. Instead, you disappeared. You erased yourself. You took her." He motioned toward Lily, his voice thick with emotion. "You took my daughter." Lily's breath hitched, her head snapping toward Margaret. "Is that true?" Her voice was raw, filled with something fragile and breaking. Margaret's lips trembled. "Emma, I..." Lily took a step back, shaking her head. "No, don't call me that. Don't call me anything until you tell me the truth. All of it." A thick silence settled over them, the weight of years of secrets pressing down on them like an unbearable force. Margaret swallowed hard, closing her eyes for a brief moment before exhaling slowly. When she opened them again, her gaze was firm, resigned. "You should come inside," she said softly. Henry hesitated. Everything in him was screaming to demand answers right here, right now. But one look at Lily, at the sheer devastation on her face, made him swallow his pride. This wasn't just his pain anymore. This was hers too. Without another word, Margaret stepped back, opening the door wider, and they followed her inside. The house was small, simple, with an air of neglect that told Henry that Margaret had been living in solitude for a long time. Dust lined the wooden furniture, faded curtains hung loosely over the windows, and stacks of unopened letters sat untouched on a nearby table. It was as if time had stopped inside these walls, as if Margaret had been living in limbo, waiting for something or someone that never came. Margaret led them into the living room, motioning for them to sit. Henry remained standing, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, while Lily sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped together in her lap. She looked like she was holding herself together by sheer force of will. Margaret sat down across from them, wringing her hands. "I don't know where to start," she admitted. Henry's voice was cold. "Try the beginning." Margaret swallowed hard. "The storm," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That night, it changed everything." Henry's chest tightened. "I remember looking for you, searching through the wreckage. I remember screaming your names." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "And then I woke up in a hospital, alone." Margaret's expression filled with pain. "You weren't supposed to wake up at all." A cold chill ran down Henry's spine. "What?" Margaret exhaled shakily. "That night, you were unconscious when they found you. They thought you wouldn't survive. And someone made sure you wouldn't." Lily sucked in a sharp breath. "What are you saying?" Margaret's hands trembled. "There were people who didn't want you to find us, Henry. People who had been watching us for years. And when that storm hit, when we were separated, they saw it as an opportunity." Henry felt the blood drain from his face. "Who?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know exactly. I only know that when I woke up, they were already there. They told me you were dead." Her voice broke, her eyes filled with tears. "They told me I had no one left, that the only way to protect Emma was to leave everything behind, to start over, to become someone else." Henry's knees felt weak. He took a step back, gripping the edge of the chair for support. "You believed them." Margaret looked at him, her face lined with sorrow. "I had no reason not to." Lily's hands tightened into fists. "And me?" Her voice was sharp, filled with something dangerously close to betrayal. "Did you ever tell me who I really was?" Margaret's gaze softened. "I thought I was protecting you." Lily let out a bitter laugh. "Protecting me? By lying to me? By keeping me in the dark?" Margaret reached for her, but Lily flinched away. "I didn't know what else to do," Margaret whispered. "I was scared, Emma." Lily shot up from the couch, her entire body shaking. Stop calling me that. I don't even know if that's who I am." Her voice cracked, her breaths coming in sharp, uneven gasps. "I've spent my whole life not knowing who I am, not knowing where I come from. And now you're telling me you knew? That you could have told me the truth all along." Margaret's face crumbled. "I thought I was doing what was best." Lily let out a shaky breath, then turned away, pressing a hand to her forehead. Henry's fists clenched. "You had no right." Margaret's eyes snapped to his, something fiery and desperate in them. "And what would you have done, Henry? What if you had woken up in that hospital and someone told you that your family was gone? That the only way to survive was to disappear?" Henry's voice was raw. "I would have fought. I would have searched. I would have never stopped looking." Margaret's lip trembled. "That's the difference between you and me." Silence fell over the room, thick with unspoken words, with years of pain and regret. Lily turned back around slowly, her voice quiet. "And the people who did this? The ones who took my past from me?" Margaret's expression darkened. "They're still out there." Henry's breath caught in his throat. Margaret looked between them, her hands tightening in her lap. "And if we're asking questions, if we're looking for the truth," she swallowed hard, "they won't let us walk away this time." Henry felt the weight of Margaret's words settle deep in his chest, pressing against his ribs like an invisible force. "They won't let us walk away this time." The air in the small, dimly lit house was thick with tension, with the ghosts of years lost and secrets buried too deep to stay hidden. He stared at Margaret, his mind reeling, trying to process everything she had just said. The idea that someone, some group, had orchestrated all of this, had deliberately torn them apart, had kept him from his wife and daughter for 30 years. It was almost too much to believe. And yet, deep down, it made a terrifying kind of sense. Lily sat rigid on the couch, her fingers digging into her sweater, her face pale, her eyes darting between them. She looked like she wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Henry took a slow, measured breath. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice low, controlled. "No more half-truths, no more secrets. I want everything." Margaret swallowed hard. "I already told you what happened that night," she said quietly. "After the storm, I woke up in a hospital, just like you. But before I even had a chance to ask questions, they came." "Who?" Henry demanded. Margaret hesitated, her gaze flickering to Lily before returning to Henry. "I don't know their names. I never did. They were just men in suits, professional, cold, methodical. They knew everything about me, about us. They told me you were dead, that Emma and I had no one left, and that if we wanted to survive, we had to disappear." Henry's jaw tightened. "And you believed them?" Margaret's eyes flashed with something sharp. "What choice did I have, Henry? I had a 3-year-old daughter, no home, no money. And these people, they weren't just suggesting we start over. They were making it clear that if I didn't listen, there would be consequences." A cold shiver ran down Henry's spine. "Consequences?" Margaret exhaled shakily. "They didn't say it outright. They didn't need to. But I knew. I felt it. The way they watched me. The way they controlled everything. I was too afraid to fight back." She looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "So I ran. I took the new identity they gave me. I took Emma, and I never looked back." Lily let out a shaky breath, shaking her head. "But why? Why would they want to keep us apart?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "Because of what we knew. Or maybe, because of what we weren't supposed to know." Henry felt his stomach twist. "What does that mean?" Margaret hesitated for a long moment before reaching for a small, worn wooden box on the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, pulling out a faded photograph. She passed it to Henry. He took it carefully, his breath catching as he recognized the image. It was a picture of their family. Him, Margaret, and a tiny, smiling Emma. But it wasn't just the photo itself that made his blood run cold. It was what was written on the back. "You were never supposed to remember." A silence fell over the room, thick, suffocating. Henry turned the photo over in his hands, his pulse pounding. "What the hell does this mean?" Margaret exhaled slowly. I don't know, but I found it tucked inside one of Emma's baby blankets the night we left. I don't even remember packing it. It was just there. Lily's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph. Someone left this for you? Margaret nodded. I think so. Maybe someone who didn't agree with what was happening. Maybe someone who wanted me to find the truth. But I was too scared to ask questions. I was too scared to look. Henry's grip on the photo tightened. Well, I'm not scared. Not anymore. He turned to Ethan, who had been standing silently near the doorway, watching everything unfold with the sharp, calculating look of a man already piecing together the puzzle in his mind. Can you track them? Ethan hesitated. Track who? We don't even know who they are, Henry. No names, no records, no leads. Henry's jaw clenched. Then we find a lead. Margaret looked up suddenly, something flickering in her eyes. There is one place we could start. Everyone turned to her. She licked her lips nervously. I don't know if they're still there, but when we first moved, there was someone who used to check in on us. A man. I never knew his real name, but he called himself James Holloway. Ethan frowned. And you think he was part of it? Margaret shook her head. I don't know. He was different. He never threatened me. He never told me what to do. But he always seemed to know too much. And then one day, he just disappeared. Henry's pulse quickened. Where did you last see him? Margaret hesitated. There's an old motel just outside of town. The last time I saw him, that's where he was staying. Ethan grabbed his laptop, already typing. I'll see if I can find anything. If he was using that name, maybe he left a trail. Henry turned to Lily, his voice steady. Are you ready for this? Lily swallowed hard, but there was something fierce in her gaze now. Something determined. I have to be. Henry nodded, and for the first time in 30 years he felt it. The pull of something bigger. The unraveling of a truth long buried. And he knew this wasn't just about finding out what happened. It was about surviving what came next. The drive to the motel was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. Henry kept his hands tight on the wheel, his mind racing. The past was no longer just a collection of painful memories. It was alive, breathing, waiting for him just beyond the horizon. When they finally arrived, the place was exactly as Margaret had described. Run down, nearly abandoned, the neon sign flickering weakly in the night. It was the kind of place people went to disappear. Henry parked the car, glancing at Ethan and Lily. Stay close. They stepped inside. The front desk was empty, the smell of old cigarette smoke and dust thick in the air. Henry approached the counter, tapping the bell. No answer. He frowned, glancing around. James Holloway. Does that name sound familiar? The old man behind the counter barely looked up. Ain't seen him in years. Henry's pulse quickened. But he was here? The man nodded. Yeah. Stayed in room 206 for a while. Left one night, never came back. Henry exchanged a look with Ethan. We need to see that room. The man scoffed. Not happening. Ethan sighed, pulling out a wad of cash and sliding it across the counter. The man barely hesitated before grabbing it and tossing them a key. Last room on the left, he muttered. Henry wasted no time, moving down the hallway with Ethan and Lily close behind. The moment they reached the door, a familiar unease settled in his stomach. Something wasn't right. He pushed the door open and stopped dead. The room was empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Just one thing sitting perfectly in the center of the floor. A single folded note. Henry stepped forward, picking it up with shaking hands. He unfolded it slowly, his breath catching as he read the words written in familiar, jagged handwriting. You're getting too close. Walk away now. This is your last warning. Henry's grip tightened, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. But he didn't feel fear. He felt rage. And for the first time in 30 years, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't walking away. Henry's fingers tightened around the note, his knuckles turning white. The words on the paper burned into his mind like fire. You're getting too close. Walk away now. This is your last warning. His pulse pounded in his ears, a mixture of rage and something darker, something he refused to name, coursing through his veins. He had spent years believing he had lost everything, drowning in grief, only to find out that the truth had been buried beneath a web of lies. And now, when he was finally close to answers, someone still wanted to keep him in the dark. Not this time. Lily stood beside him, her breath uneven, her body tense. He could feel the weight of her confusion, her fear, and he hated that she had been dragged into this nightmare. But she wasn't backing down. He could see it in her eyes, the same fire that had always burned in Margaret's when she was determined to protect the people she loved. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. This isn't just some warning, Henry. Whoever left this note knew we'd come here. They're watching us. Henry forced himself to take a deep breath, steadying his shaking hands. Then let's give them something to watch. He turned to Margaret. Do you remember anything else about this James Holloway? Anything that might tell us where to go next? Margaret hesitated, her brows knitting together. He was careful, never said much about himself. But there was one thing: he always had a book with him. The same one. He never read it, just carried it around. I remember thinking it was strange. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Do you remember the title? Margaret bit her lip, then nodded. Yes, The Silent Truth. Ethan pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. Got it. It's an old novel, nothing significant. But let's see if... He stopped suddenly, his face going pale. Henry's stomach dropped. What is it? Ethan turned the phone around. The screen displayed a scanned newspaper article, the headline jumping out at them like a scream. Journalist James Holloway found dead? Possible foul play? Henry's breath caught. He snatched the phone from Ethan, his eyes scanning the article. James Holloway, investigative reporter, disappeared 5 years ago. Body discovered in a burned-down house under suspicious circumstances. Case remains unsolved. A cold chill ran down Henry's spine. He was a journalist. Ethan's jaw tightened. And he was investigating something before he died. Something they didn't want him to find. Lily let out a shaky breath. What if he was trying to help us? What if that's why he was always watching? Margaret's eyes darkened. Then they silenced him before he could. Silence stretched between them, heavy, suffocating. Henry clenched his fists. We need to find out what he was working on before he died. If he was looking for the truth, maybe he left something behind. Ethan nodded. I'll start digging. If there's anything left of his research, I'll find it. Henry turned to Lily. And we're not leaving you alone. If they know who you are, we don't know how far they'll go to keep you from remembering. Lily swallowed hard but nodded. I want to know the truth. Henry exhaled. Then let's find it. They didn't sleep that night. Ethan worked relentlessly, scanning through old archives, breaking through firewalls that should have been impossible to crack. Margaret stayed quiet, her eyes locked on the floor, her face unreadable, and Lily sat beside Henry, staring at the faded photograph of their family, her fingers tracing the edges as if trying to remember something long buried in the depths of her mind. Hours passed, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on them. Then, just as the first light of dawn crept through the window, Ethan let out a sharp breath. Got something. Henry shot up. What is it? Ethan turned the laptop around. Holloway's last known investigation. The files were scrubbed from official records, but someone saved them on an encrypted drive. It's all here: interviews, research, notes. And there's one name that keeps coming up. Henry leaned in, his heart pounding. Who? Ethan hesitated before speaking. Daniel Whitmore. Margaret sucked in a sharp breath. No, that's not possible. Henry turned to her. Who is he? Margaret's face was pale. He's the man who took me and Emma the night of the storm. Henry felt the ground shift beneath him. You remember him? Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes haunted. I never knew his name, but I remember his face. And now I know why. Because he wasn't just some random agent. She looked up at them, her voice shaking. He was watching us long before the storm. Henry's blood ran cold. Why? Margaret exhaled. Because you were getting too close to something, Henry, and they had to make sure you never found out what it was. Silence fell over them, heavy with unspoken truths. Then Ethan turned the screen back to them. Daniel Whitmore is still alive, and according to these records, he's not far. Henry didn't hesitate. Then let's go find him. The address led them to an old cabin deep in the woods, hidden away from the world. It was isolated, the kind of place people went to disappear. Henry parked the car a short distance away, his body thrumming with tension. Lily's breath was uneven beside him. What if he won't talk? Henry's jaw tightened. Then we make him. Margaret reached for his arm. Henry, be careful. We don't know what we're walking into. Henry nodded, then stepped forward. The others followed close behind. The door creaked as Henry knocked, the sound echoing through the empty woods. Nothing. He knocked again. Daniel Whitmore, we need to talk. A long silence. Then finally, the door opened. An older man stood there, his face lined with years of secrets and regrets. His sharp eyes flickered between them, settling on Margaret. And then he did something Henry didn't expect. He sighed and stepped aside. Come in, he said quietly. Henry exchanged a look with Ethan, then nodded. They stepped inside. The cabin was bare, stripped of any signs of comfort. Daniel moved slowly, sitting down at the small wooden table. He gestured for them to do the same. Margaret was the first to speak. You were there, she said, her voice raw. That night, you were the one who took us. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. Henry's hands curled into fists. Why? Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Because you were asking questions about something that should have stayed buried. He met Henry's gaze. You don't remember, do you? Henry's pulse pounded. Remember what? Daniel hesitated. Then finally he spoke. The storm wasn't an accident, Henry. A heavy silence filled the room. Henry's breath caught in his throat. What are you saying? Daniel leaned forward. I'm saying someone wanted you dead, and when the storm wasn't enough, they made sure you never found your family again. Henry felt the world tilt. Lily's voice was barely a whisper. Then who did this? Daniel's expression darkened. You already know the answer. Henry's stomach twisted as realization hit him. And then, Daniel spoke the name that changed everything. Ethan Carter. The world shattered. Lily gasped. Margaret's face went pale. And Henry turned, his breath stolen from his lungs. Ethan sat still, silent, expressionless. And in that moment, Henry realized he had trusted the wrong man. Silence consumed the room like a thick, suffocating fog. Henry could hear his own heartbeat, rapid and uneven, thundering against his ribs. His fingers twitched at his sides. Every muscle in his body coiled tight with disbelief and something far worse, betrayal. The name hung in the air, poisoning everything around them. Ethan Carter. Lily's breath hitched. Margaret's face had gone completely pale, her hands trembling as she stared at Ethan, as if seeing him for the first time. But it was Henry who felt the most hollow, the most empty, because for the past few weeks he had trusted this man. He had relied on him. He had believed that Ethan was on his side, that he had been helping them uncover the truth. And now Henry realized he had been played. Ethan didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't even deny it. Henry swallowed, his throat burning. Tell me he's lying, he said, his voice low, raw, barely restrained. Tell me this is some kind of mistake. Ethan finally exhaled, slow and measured. His face, usually filled with sharp wit and easy confidence, was unreadable. I was hoping we wouldn't get to this point, he murmured. Lily flinched like she had been struck. So it's true. Ethan's gaze flickered toward her, something like regret flashing in his eyes. It's not that simple, Lily. Henry took a step forward, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Then make it simple, he growled. Tell us what the hell is going on, Ethan. Tell us what you did. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face, and for the first time, Henry saw it. The exhaustion, the weight of whatever secrets he had been carrying. "I didn't lie to you," he said quietly. "Not about everything. I didn't fake the records, I didn't plant the notes. But I knew more than I told you." Henry's hands curled into fists. "You knew Margaret was alive." Ethan's silence was confirmation enough. Lily's voice shook. "You knew who I was." Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, then nodded. "Yes." Margaret let out a quiet gasp, pressing a hand to her mouth. Henry could barely breathe. The room around him felt smaller, suffocating. "Why?" His voice cracked with the weight of everything. "Why would you do this?" Ethan finally looked at him, and in his eyes, Henry saw something unexpected: sadness. "Because I was trying to protect you." Henry laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Protect me? Protect me from what?" Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "From the same people who took Margaret and Emma. From the same people who made you disappear that night." His voice dropped, turning deadly serious. "Henry, you don't remember what happened before the storm, but you were asking questions. Dangerous questions. And you got too close. So they did what they always do." He exhaled slowly. "They erased you." The room spun. Henry stumbled back a step, his head swimming. "No," he whispered. "That's not." "You lost your memory for a reason," Ethan interrupted. "The injuries from the storm didn't just happen. You were found unconscious, Henry. Found. And the people who found you, they made sure you never remembered what you were looking for." Henry's breath was shallow, his mind spiraling. "What was I looking for?" Ethan hesitated. "Something that could destroy them." Margaret inhaled sharply. "Who are they?" Ethan hesitated again, and Henry saw it. Fear. Genuine fear. Ethan Carter was many things, but Henry had never seen him afraid, and that terrified him. "They don't have a name," Ethan said finally. "At least not one that you'll ever find on a record. But they exist. They manipulate things from the shadows. They erase people, rewrite history, make sure no one ever asks too many questions. And 30 years ago, Henry," Ethan met his gaze, "you got too close to exposing them." Henry's chest rose and fell unevenly. "Then why didn't they just kill me?" Ethan sighed. "Because killing you would have left a trail. But making you forget? Making you disappear into the streets, broken and alone? That was cleaner." Lily was shaking. "And me? Why erase me?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Because you're the key to everything, Lily. And if you ever remembered who you were, they knew it would lead back to the truth." Silence. A long, unbearable silence. And then Henry took a deep breath, the rage inside him simmering into something colder, sharper, more focused. "Then it's time we make them remember us." Ethan looked at him carefully. "Henry, you don't understand." "No," Henry cut him off. "I understand perfectly." He turned to Lily, his voice softer but no less determined. "They stole everything from us. Our lives, our family, our memories, and now they think they can keep us in the dark forever." His jaw tightened. "They're wrong." Lily swallowed hard, but then she nodded. "I want to remember, no matter what it takes." Margaret exhaled shakily. "Then we have to be careful, because if they know we're looking, they won't just warn us next time." Henry nodded. He knew it too. This was far from over. But for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't lost. He wasn't wandering. He had a purpose. He had a fight, and he was going to win. 2 days later, Henry sat at a small diner, watching the people around him. Margaret and Lily were across from him, both still processing everything they had learned. Ethan was gone. He had left after explaining everything, saying he had to cover their tracks, to buy them more time before they came for them. Henry didn't know if he trusted him anymore, but right now that didn't matter, because as he sat there, something happened. A waitress, one he had never seen before, approached their table. She placed a tray down in front of him. A burger. Henry frowned. "We didn't order this." The waitress smiled faintly. "It's on the house." Then, before he could respond, she walked away. Henry stared at the burger. Something was off. His heart pounded as he reached forward, carefully lifting the bun. A small, crumpled piece of paper lay inside. His breath caught as he unfolded it. 3 words. "Emma is alive." Lily gasped. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Henry stared at the note, his entire body frozen. And then, he smiled, because the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.